you can do the body weight exercises and go for runs completely solo and create change. And that is really, really hard. And for most people with most kind of like normal levels of discipline and willpower is not enough. The gym might help. See every January and February when it's chock full of folks. And
when we can't get a lane.
Carry forward and a lot drop off.
Yeah.
And then the final one, the most expensive one, people who have worked with trainers, and you've got this feeling where like there is a literal human being waiting for me at the place where we train. And if I don't show up, that they're just going to be standing there.
Yeah.
Like that. That's how I think about transformation and like partnering with folks as well.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I'm Rodney Evans, and that guy with whom I am twinning is Sam Spurlin.
That's right. We called each other very early this morning. So what are you wearing? What am I wearing? Let's make sure we match.
Let's make sure. So check it out on YouTube. It's funny. Welcome back to Outwork with Reddy. This is a podcast about modernizing organizations as the future of work meets the present moment.
Each episode, we turn our attention to one common organizational pattern that we think is worth pulling apart like a boiled lobster. And then we share ideas for what to do instead.
God, I love lobster. This week, we're talking about DIY transformation. I'm very excited to dig into this because a lot of you who are listening are people that I talk to about organizational design or change agents out there in the world doing it inside companies, doing it yourselves. And y'all complain to me all the time about how hard it is. And so we're going to unpack that today. But before we do, let us check in.
Let us check in with the very rare, relevant check-in question, which is, what is a DIY victory or failure you've had recently?
And
I don't mean organizationally. I just mean like in life.
No, one immediately came to mind because it happened right before this podcast.
Excellent.
Okay, so you know how I don't cook food?
Yes.
Under any circumstances. And I just got back from a yoga retreat and I spent a lot of time learning about Ayurvedic eating. And so since I've been home, I've been trying to do things that should make my energy better. And one of those things that was recommended to me was having like stewed apples or pears for breakfast instead of half a pot of coffee and anger. And and so this morning I was like, I'm going to make my stewed apples, and I put them on the stove, and then I got distracted and then they burned to a crisp, which I only realized because I smelled it wasn't a fire yet, but it was really smoky.
It was all pre-fire.
It was pre-fire. It was like I had to take the pot outside and like let it sit out there so that the fire department didn't come.
I bet you had a couple of minutes of like, oh, that smells really good.
Yeah. I was like,
then
it smells like Christmas. Too far. Yeah. And then I was like, my house is going to burn down. And then of course I'm trying to get it all like aired out and normal before Ed gets home, because he'll be like, how on earth did you burn apples in water to this degree? And the answer is obviously embarrassing, which is why I'm telling all of you and not my husband.
Excellent. Which, does Ed listen to the podcast?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
Then your secret
I don't think
is
he's
safe.
listened to an episode.
Your secret is safe
good.
with the thousands of people who have just heard this.
I can talk about it here. It's fine. Yeah.
Right,
what about you?
I promise that I had this answer like ready to go before you shared your kind of cooking failure, because my DIY victory, I was just going to give myself props for like basically doing DIY dinner every night. Like I am the cook in my house, and I would say 95% of the time it's like me making something at home and sitting down with my wife to eat it together. And it's easy to like not do that. And many days I don't want to do that. And I'm not making necessarily gourmet shit every day, but decided to give myself some props for DIY food, AKA cooking.
Well, DIY food. Some of you lay people might know that as cooking dinner.
Well, because I was trying to think about something more traditionally DIY, and like I live in an apartment. I've always lived in apartments. Sure. One of the perks of living in an apartment is in terms of like DIY repairs and stuff, not really a thing that I have to worry about. Nor do I feel gifted at doing.
Me neither.
Yeah. All right.
Sweet.
So we stayed on one theme, but we covered both sides of it.
Yes, successes and failures. Okay, so here's the pattern that we're going to pull apart like lobster claws today. When the ready is selling work, the number one reason that something doesn't go through is because the client says they're going to do it themselves. It's very rarely because of competition. It's sometimes because they're not going to do it at all, but usually it is because whatever kind of transformative operationalization of strategy they called us about, they have decided that their OD or OE or HR or transfo office or whomever can handle it. It is also something that we hear very frequently when those same people call again in 6 or 12 months because they haven't been able to make progress. And like all things, we don't think that's because those people are incapable or inept. We think that there's something larger going on. So there is some pattern here of like try, fail, repeat. And that is what we're going to explore today. Is there anything you'd add to that, Sam, that you think is particularly interesting as we dive into this one?
No, I mean, I think that's the basic pattern. Our number one competitor is folks deciding to do it themselves, and the number one thing we hear when those come back around is, the doing it ourselves didn't necessarily work all that great. So I think there's something interesting to dig into there, because it is more nuanced than like hire the ready no matter what, or
Sure.
the opposite of DIY is like we'll do it for you. Like it's not that. There's a lot.
It's
to
not
dig
that,
into, I think,
for sure. Okay, so why do people DIY? Let's just start there. What are some of the main reasons that you hear?
So I think the first reason people DIY it themselves is because the impulse there to do the work is actually a really good and positive one. It makes me think a
Yeah.
lot about our RACI episode, where we were pretty critical of RACIs as a specific practice or artifact, but gave a lot of hat tips to the impulse, to the energy that somebody has to have to kind of land on RACIs as a thing worth
Right.
trying. And there's
Right.
something there with DIY efforts as well, because ultimately, even when we partner with somebody for a long time, that work continues on when we leave, and that DIY ethos has to live. Otherwise, when we leave, it all falls apart.
+1. And I will say, in my heavy consulting days, all of my best projects that I've ever done, not just at the ready, but in my life, the client had tried to do it themselves.
Yeah.
First.
Yeah.
And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is like the one that you're saying, which is like the energy and the impulse to really try was already there, which is a really helpful starting point, because we're not starting from the perspective of me being like, what if you didn't hate it here? And then being like, it's okay. It's like we already are aligned on something needs to be done. Two is they just have like a lot more empathy for how hard it is to do this. If they call us after trying for a year or 18 months and not really getting traction, there's a little bit less like arms crossed, like I think we're good, than there is when they're fresh to the scene.
Totally.
And three is, and it's sort of along those lines, but I think they have, I think buyers and sort of change agents, whether that's like leader of a transformation office or a strategy office or like an OD person, they just also have such a good sense of what it really takes if they've really tried it. And one of my favorite projects ever was like an agile office called us that had been at it for a year, and they were like, we are stalled out and we are tired. Please come here and help us.
Totally. Well, and those are the folks too, where when you do make some visible progress, which could even feel really minor to us, they're like, oh my God,
psyched.
I can't believe how much progress we're making, which is always nice to get those vibes going.
The best.
I think the other thing that I just wanted to throw out into the conversation earlier rather than later is that I think it's important to set up like what we're talking about here. Like the opposite of DIY is not like we do it for you, like full service. Like we'll come in and like run your stuff and then hand it to you, and now you're good to go. Like there is still some very much needed DIY energy, even when fully engaged with us. And some
Yeah.
of the most frustrating projects have been the ones where there's like no DIY energy at all. And there seems to be this expectation like, well, this is what the ready is here for. Like they're going to do the thing and then
Right.
give it to us and then we'll be done. And that
Yeah.
is also a major recipe for failure.
And this is a really smart point to make. God, I feel like you and I could talk about this particular thing for like 1,000 years because so much of it is learning like what we've learned from doing this work and then seeing how people inside of companies make the same mistakes that we made, blah, blah, blah. But to the point that you just made, don't believe any agency or consulting firm really that says they can do anything for you without
Yeah.
your cooperation. Like it's impossible. So
Yeah.
if anyone comes to you and says they can change your culture without your engagement and participation, they're full of shit. Secondly, I feel like the point that you just made, which I want to make to all of our like change agent homies out there in the world, is when we started really parsing out the skills that it takes to be a transformer, one of the skills that rose to the top was a skill around contracting. And contracting is very different than consulting. Contracting is like negotiating and renegotiating the boundaries of the work, the requirements of both parties, the working agreements that we have, et cetera, et cetera. Contracting is so hard to do, I think, under the best of circumstances. And I think when the call is coming from inside the house, it's even harder because often if you're, say, an OE lead, who's like say like a senior director level, which I see a lot in lots of organizations I know, it's hard to contract with the C-suite or with the executive team to really say, I need you to show up this way for this many hours in these kinds of structures. We're going to talk more about that. But just to say out loud right now, I think that is like a place where we used to scrape our knees too. And we also used to fall into the trap that you're talking about where like they'd be like, yeah,
Totally.
you got it. And we'd be like, we got it. And then we'd get a little further and we'd be like, no, we really need you guys to like show up though to this.
Yeah.
Like we can't do it by ourselves.
Totally. And not to make this super navel gazy to the point of irrelevance, but I think that's one of the things that we got a lot better at in how we sell the work too. I think early days, there is like an impulse to like, say the thing to get the sale. Don't be like untruthful. But I think you can kind of skate by by not articulating really clearly what it's going to take on their
What it's going to
side.
take.
And yeah, and now I think we are so much crisper about that. And if we are getting vibes that the potential client does not have the capacity or interest in like truly partnering, then we save all of ourselves a lot of trouble by like not even continuing down that path.
Yeah, I just think like nobody should waste their time and money. And there's so much data that transformation efforts and change efforts fail or have middling results. And it's like if it's hard under the best of circumstances to change things in companies, small and large.
Yeah.
If you're set up for failure, like it's impossible. So let's not do that.
Totally. Cool. Well, let's dig into this. And in the spirit of setups, you have this item here. I'm wondering if maybe we can start here. You wrote orgs are set up wrong for transformation, and I want to like hear more about that because I don't know where my brain goes immediately. So I think you have something smart here.
Oh, well, let's see. So in terms of sort of the essential thing about this pattern, or one facet of it, uh, it's really interesting, Sam, because I'm having a lot of external conversations right now where it feels like the market in many ways is catching up with the idea that change management is a real thing, which is hilarious to me because like we think change management is a 30-year-old practice that needs reinvention, and it does. But I think what's under it is that people are executives and humans are having the lived experience over and over and over again of things shifting drastically, of having to evolve, and of realizing that, like, doing that shouldn't be so fucking hard all the time. So I say this as preamble because it's been very interesting that right around the time that I've stopped talking about this as transformation and change, the market is like, I think what we really need here is change management and like org effectiveness and org design, which is just like a fascinating paradigm. And, as someone who lives mostly in the future, probably not that surprising. But what I see in terms of the setup that I think is not optimal is, so we buy or build a big strategy. We buy it from McKinsey, or we have a really smart strategy officer that builds it for us, or some combination of those two things. And then there is like, either it gets parsed out and handed, like, here's the product org's part of the strategy to go do. Or we spin up a transformation office and we're like, okay, you guys got to make sure all this stuff happens. And to me, at this point, transformation and execution are synonymous.
Yeah.
I'm just like, transformative activities in this world that we are all living in is operating a business. You can't say anymore. I mean, there are places where there are things that are just persistent and ongoing, but those things require reinvention. Those things require automation. Those things are still going to need to evolve. Everything has to evolve. And what I'd like to see is that in organizational P&Ls, there's really a line item for execution or operationalization of strategic initiatives that isn't just baked into the rest of the P&L, because it requires different resourcing, whether that's hiring external help, whether that's training people up, whether that's hiring, whatever the things are. We'll talk about what those things are. But when you over centralize it into a transformation office, it doesn't feel like it's really in the work. And when you totally decentralize it to say, everybody just do your bit, it tends to fall flat because it's not called out and resourced effectively. And what's bad about what I'm describing in terms of structurally where transformation, air quotes, lives, is you're not signaling to the organization with resourcing that you're serious about it.
Right.
And if basically in the like fog of operating a company, people have 9 gajillion priorities, and then you just add this on and you don't do something concerted about it, what you're telling people is it's not really going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm tracking. I'm going to embody a skeptical CEO for a second and ask you a question, and I'm curious how you would handle this.
Great.
So my skeptical kind of CEO hat is like, well, what do you mean? Like we now have a head of transformation who is an incredibly well compensated person who is responsible for all things transformation, and they have a team of experts who are running our transformation efforts. Like, they're accountable for it. We are investing in it. What do you mean, that it's not important?
Yeah, it's a very fair question, and one that I have gotten. And the answer is, it can't be either or. You can't totally centralize transformation, and you can't totally decentralize transformation. So if you have a transformation office of people who are expert transformers, like the people like us and like people we work with, great. Those people need to behave like an internal consultancy that is paired and embedded with the business or with the strategy officer to bring these new initiatives, transformative initiatives, whether it's an op model or AI or workforce planning or whatever, to light.
Yeah.
And the remit that the transformation office has is usually not that. So they either have some remit around training, which is go tell a whole bunch of people how to be a different way, or around tracking, which is make sure the business does these transformational activities. Neither of those is
sometimes.
Or comms sometimes, 100%. That's often where you have transformation and change management, like dance partners. And neither of those, this is a very third way conversation, because you can't do it one of those two ways.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good answer. I'm taking my skeptical
Thanks,
CEO
Sam.
hat off. You
Great.
convinced me. Uh,
Good.
I mean, and I think what you're pointing to is that good transformation work lives in the gray zones of
Yeah.
organizations, and much of the many of the assumptions and the structures and just legacy that exists within organizations tries to find gray zones and put them into other clearer black or white sorts of places. There's a real kind of stay in your lane energy in a lot of organizations, and transformation work is not a stay in your lane sort of body of work.
Yeah.
So the over centralization means we've really got a group of people whose lane it is to do transformation, which means at the end of the day, if you're not in that group, you can ignore that group, or it's easier
Yeah.
to ignore that group.
Yeah.
And at the other end, though, if it's completely decentralized and there's no sort of guiding aim or group of people who are stewarding what we're actually trying to do, you can also ignore that, because at that point, that's nothing. So there
Right.
really is this like interesting in between that looks different depending on your organization, and which is why the projects that we do, they all are of kind of the same family, but they look very different. When we sit around a table with our colleagues and talk about what the work looks like, it resembles each other a lot. But it's not like, oh, you're on step 3, I'm on step 2, and over here in
Right.
6 months we'll be on step 9 of the official rollout. So yeah, which I mean, I think I'm just kind of marveling and enjoying, like, that's why this work is so much fun
Yeah. And
and why
I
it
think
resists DIY efforts.
and why it resists DIY efforts. Yeah. And I think that, if I look at a successful case, like we've had Bill Anderson on this show before when he was CEO of Roche, this just to like drive the third way point home. I think that what Bill did there, from my understanding, that was really wise was like got so clear on the unassailable design principles for a very large organization, did have transformation office support to basically help make sure that those principles were clear and were well understood and were in a feedback loop with the organization, and then gave a lot of agency and resource and authority to those leaders out in regions required to make this shift to do so as they saw fit. And
Yeah.
lots of them brought in partners, and some of them pulled from internal transformation resources. And my understanding is that Bill didn't particularly care as long as the organization was moving toward these principles that he had defined. And I
Yeah.
think that's just like a nice way of thinking about this third way, which is neither fully centralized nor certainly fully like outsourced um, to somebody else.
Cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Can I hit another topic that is, I think, a
Yes.
little bit separate from what we've been talking about?
Let's do it.
All right. So one thing that I see a lot in DIY efforts that I have seen or have heard about is basically the experience of those organizations hitting local maxima. So basically, they don't know what they don't know,
I love it
and
when you use
there's
words I
this
don't know. What does local
this
maxima mean?
so imagine that you are kind of like in a landscape, and there are mountains everywhere, but you can't, from your perspective, you can only see the mountain that's right in front of you. And in
Okay,
your world, it's like this is like the
that's the
best, like
highest
this is the
mountain.
highest point. But if you
Okay,
were to like get up on that mountain or have a different perspective on the landscape, you'd realize, oh, there's this much better, higher position, like way over here, but we can't even
yeah,
see it. We don't even know it exists. And
cool.
I think that happens with like practices. The very clear example that I see is the difference between asking a team that has never really retrospected before or thought about the idea of an organizational tension, having them just write things down from their experience versus putting our tension cards in front of them and asking them to point to the
Yeah,
cards that are true for them. And you
yeah,
will always get more responses from pointing at the cards, because people say things like, oh, I didn't even notice that this was true, but it definitely is. I didn't even know that was a thing I could write down. And it's the same thing on the practice side of things too. One of the predominant feelings that I have when doing a practices exercise with a team where we haven't had a lot of time to really explore is like the disappointment in the lack of creativity in the practices. And that's not their fault. It's not anybody's fault. But if you don't know what is out there, then the idea of coming up with something that is more progressive around how we meet, if your best idea about how to improve meetings is like, make sure somebody wrote the agenda, like that might help. But there's a whole world of thinking about meetings differently. And if you're DIYing it, you run the risk of really just focusing in on the things that already exist within your system. And if you're like most organizations, that's like it's a limited experience because most of us are not org designers.
Exactly. The thing about that I think is really interesting, Sam, is I guess it's two things. One is what you're saying is sort of predicated on the idea that this kind of work is a real discipline. That systems thinking and designing ways of working and reinventing an operating system and, filling in that twilight zone is a skill like finance or a skill like marketing. And it's like, as a person who has only recently been around marketing, what I'm learning is like marketing is a skill. Like there are a bunch of levers that you can pull. And there's there's a lot there if you're an expert in marketing. And for reasons we've talked about on this show, it would be like the situation you're describing where you bring an average team together and say, talk about tensions or talk about ways of working that are holding you back or talk about ways to make it better is like asking me how to do marketing. I'm like, we make a podcast. Should we do, I don't know, more podcasts? Like it's always going to be incremental. It's always going to be lowercase innovation. And it's always going to be a riff on something that always exists because there's not a level of expertise to say, I know something radically better than my experience. Because how would you if you hadn't done any of this as a living?
Totally. And we love incremental things, but I think what you run the risk of doing in DIY, if you're going purely DIY, you end up with incremental ambition instead of just incremental experimentation. Like we want big ambition, have big sense of like what is possible, even if the steps to get there are going to be incremental. And I think sometimes I see the gaze is too low when running a DIY transformation often, or it is so radically high and completely like unconnected from reality that it might as well just be nonsense.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the one other thing that I would say about this is like, it's just really hard, I think, when you're internal. And look, like I've done this job. I do understand and I have a lot of empathy for people who are in this kind of role. It's what led me to doing this work, was working on transformative projects internally inside of a large organization and frankly being very frustrated by that. And also I was doing a million things that I would not do now and that I think are really dumb. But I understand what it feels like. And like the constraint when you're in one of those roles of how much of the organizational OS you have to live with as you're trying to make disruptive change is incredibly high. Mm-hmm. So like when I start working with a new client, I'm just like, I'm going to add you to a Slack channel. We're going to immediately start working in a Canvas. Let's set up a rhythm of meetings. I'm going to facilitate them. This is how this is going to go. Not because I need it to be my way, but because these are ways of working that I know are very effective. And I don't need them to explain to me how they're doing it when they're hiring me to do it better.
Yeah.
When you're the OE person inside of an organization, It's very difficult, I think, to start on a project and be like, what if we created a team space rather than using email? And what if we used a Kanban board rather than using PowerPoint? And what if we had an operating rhythm of meetings that looked like this from the drop? And what if we started with a team chart? Like, it's hard to do that because you seem like a space alien. When it's me, they expect me to be a space alien. That's why they're paying me. When it's your buddy from down the hall, you just seem like a weirdo. And I'm not totally sure how to get around that. But it's like, I think our version of like, quote unquote, meet them where they are and an internal person's version of meet them where they are just looks like very different.
Yeah, I completely see that. And you know, part of me is thinking like, well, if you're internal and you're doing those things, in some ways that is like the subtle transformation, but really it is also just a huge distraction to like getting into the actual work. Like if I have to fight 3 battles to have a marginally better way of communicating with my team, like I have limited energy to spend on things, and maybe that's not the greatest use of my time and attention.
Totally. And also, when you talk to somebody who does what we do internally about what areas of the OS they can touch, it's like
Yeah.
2. So when you're like, can we, how close can you get to comp? How close can you get to structure? How close can you get to tooling? And they're like, a mile away. There's an iron wall between us. Absolutely not. It's like, okay, well, that's going to make deep change hard if you can only operate in one field of the canvas.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think we should dig into something that I see both of us have kind of prepared in our notes, and I know you're really articulate about, which is power. How does power show up in DIY versus kind of non-DIY transformation efforts?
I mean, I think this is like the biggest, I don't want to say problem, but I think it's the biggest limiter. The essential power dynamics at play between an internal change team and everybody else are really, really tricky. And a tale as old as time that I hear, I've heard this a lot from people who are listening to this podcast right now. Before you at me, I'm not talking about any one of you. There's like a dozen of you listening that have said this to me, so don't email me. The group gets spun up or the person gets hired. They have a lofty remit around doing transformational work. They try to make a go of it. The dance partner on the business side, it gives them the Heisman and is like, nah, I think I'm good. Or like, a version of this that would be interesting to me is X. Or just like, no, thank you. In service of trying to get momentum and get some things going, they end up doing work for the business that they don't believe is transformational, just to sort of get a seat at the table and be helpful and hopefully create some relational capital so they can do something interesting at some point. They become something of an order taker over time. Over time, the business is like, oh yeah, I call that guy when I need to like do an offsite and he comes and facilitates it for me and I don't have to pay somebody, which is great. And when that cycle repeats long enough, eventually some executive goes, I don't really know what the impact of this group is to the organization, but I know it's a line item in my budget. I'm going to cut it.
Yeah.
And that kind of breaks my heart because it's such a foreseeable cliff to fall off of. And it's also such a rational pattern to fall into.
Yeah. Yeah. There's generally like such long history in organizations. I mean, some of these executive teams have been working together for a really long time.
Totally.
I mean, even if the team has not been working together for a long time, often the people have all been in the organization for a long time. And those long histories, I think, often start to show themselves and clash in transformation efforts. And when I think back on projects that I have worked on, what is true is not that those histories didn't exist or that they didn't sometimes rear their heads. It's that there was a coalition who was paying for us to be there. And we weren't kind of seen as the lapdogs of any one executive or any one function, but there was a group of people who had kind of all chipped in to this body of work that we were helping to actually make true. And that somehow has felt healthier and I think harder to do. I would imagine is harder to do in a DIY effort where everybody is internal. Yeah, I don't know. Have you seen that pattern as well?
I have, yeah, I have seen that pattern, and I do think the coalition that sort of cuts through the structural noise is is helpful, and frankly, um, I feel like one time I have a friend who's a serial founder, and he was helping me pick an attorney to
Cinnamon
deal
Toast
with.
Crunch, Cheerios.
Very nice. Wow. And he was helping me to pick a lawyer to deal with something like particularly thorny. And he was like, listen, you want to work with Neil? He is a total pit bull. And he was like, you got it. Sometimes like you got to just outsource the pit bull in situations like this. And I find sometimes in those coalitions, we end up being the pit bull. And
Yeah.
I mean that with, in a way that Rosie is a pit bull who loves you, but also will, rip your throat out. It's like, sometimes we can be the people because we have less on the line to say to the executive, like, yeah, you're smoking crack right now. And I think executives look to us to do that. I think it's so much easier for us to do that. It's so much easier for me to say to a VP of a very large organization, look, man, your heart's in the right place. This is good work. And it's going to fail if the following things don't change. That's just an easier message from me than from someone whose performance review and bonus is riding on what that executive thinks of them. Like that person is going into that conversation with a very different posture than I am because like, sure, our contract could get canceled, but I think that in those conversations, our sponsors know that we are having a difficult moment in service of their aim. We are there in service to them. And there's not the muckiness of like, we potentially are going to work together for the next 10 years. And this could really be a fork in the road for us.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's well said. Is there anything else that we wanted to hit on with this pattern?
Yeah, I want you to talk about the money. So I hit this at the beginning, but I'm going to ask you sort of like a spicy question about this.
Ooh, all right.
So I feel like when we lose business to DIY, which is literally like a tag in our pipeline in Notion, that's the most used tag.
It's also the tag that reminds us to go and reach out in about 6 months and see how things are going.
How's it going? How you doing? I literally have an email that just says, how goes the DIY, that I send to people like once every 6 months. There are a lot of reasons that work ends up being DIY first. As we've talked about a bunch today, I think a lot of them are good reasons. I encourage people to take a swing at it. And look, if they can figure out how to make a go of it, don't hire somebody. Like that's dope. Do it to it, and
then sell that into the market.
For sure. Like that's level 5 of the future of HR model is like become a marketplace, go sell it to somebody else. I think that's rad. But a lot of times the excuse given is around money. And on the one hand, it's a very easy argument to make, which is like, these people are already here. We're already paying their salaries. Let's just use them, quote unquote. On the other hand, there is something about it that feels a bit fraught to me because I don't think that like the real cost of DIY is often well understood and like the real impact, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, I want you to tell me about the money.
Well, when I think about kind of cost of DIY, the cost is hidden, right? Because at least it's not as obvious as like we're paying consulting firm X amount a month to do this work. And it's really embedded in just the problems and the tensions of your OS. It's all the bad meetings and all of the go backs on decisions and all the decisions that take forever. And whether or not we make progress on that is, kind of the monetary upside of our work. I think the interesting thing about partnering in transformation work is that fundamentally, in every transformation that's happening in an organization or any organization that's trying to do something other than business as usual, people are looking around and asking themselves, is this real? Like, is this a real thing? Is this a flavor of the week? And I'm not saying that if you pay to have a consulting firm like the Ready in working with you, that it's not, that universally signifies that it is important. But I think it does send a different signal than like, we've patched together this team of people who are going to work side of desk for 6 months to try to make something happen. Like when you've actually set aside some money, kind of made a bit of a pre-commitment to work with an organization, that does send a signal. It's like the difference between, so you're going to start getting healthy. That's the transformational effort that you're going to undertake. And your options are, I'm going to save money and just like do body weight push-ups and like pull-ups and like run at home versus I'm going to get a gym membership versus I'm going to pay for a trainer who's expecting me to, every Monday, Wednesday, or Friday at 9 a.m. And if I don't show up, I get a call and he's like, what the hell? And I paid for nothing.
And I already paid for it. Right.
Exactly. And those are three very different things. Like, yeah, you can do the body weight exercises and go for runs completely solo and create change. And that is really, really hard. And for most people with most kind of like normal levels of discipline and willpower is not enough. The gym might help. See every January and February when it's chock full of folks. And
when we can't
some carry forward and a lot drop off.
Yeah.
And then the final one, the most expensive one, people who have worked with trainers, and you've got this feeling where like there is a literal human being waiting for me at the place where we train. And if I don't show up, that they're just going to be standing there.
Yeah.
Like that, that's how I think about transformation and like partnering with folks as well.
It's such a smart way of thinking about it. And, it's as a random aside and tangent, like one of the great joys of my phase of life and even of like the Ready's phase of life is having enough success under my belt to hire experts. Yeah. Like being able, I mean, you do this too, like in your own personal life. Like I feel like there is, to me, like I would so much rather at this point in my life spend money on like having an Ayurvedic consult, a cello teacher, a wonderful yoga studio that I go to. Like I want to be in the presence of people who know their shit because my results being around and held accountable by those people are so much better than when I'm just like, I'm going to watch a YouTube video or I'm going to like talk to ChatGPT or I'm going to like, take a swing at it or take an online course or something like that. And it's like, not everybody can afford these things in their personal life or in their organizational life. And I think we undervalue sometimes how it's, to me, the price to value of having an expert in my life who really knows about something that I want to be awesome at. I can't think of better money to spend.
No, yeah, I agree. And it gets you out of that thing that we, I'm sure, have said many times on this podcast, which is trying harder is not a strategy.
It's not a strategy.
And I think fundamentally, a lot of DIY transformation falls into the category of like, we're just going to try harder. Like we tried it once and it didn't go great. But we'll just do it better this time.
That's right.
And it's not, it very, very rarely is that going to actually land somewhere that it feels like where you wanted to get.
I think that's right. Exactly.
All right. So what, other than the obvious unstated assumption, which is one way that you don't do this is you just hire us. But like, that's not going to be one of our ideas.
That's not one of our ideas. Forward.
Although, it's a good one.
I mean, you can talk to us.
You talk to us. Yeah, exactly. What else? If somebody's kind of trying to work through this kind of DIY versus bringing somebody in, like where do you go in terms of ideas?
Yeah. So this is probably the biggest like topic in my mind related to this whole episode. And I chose not to talk about it as part of the pattern, but to talk to it as part of the solution. I think that overarching everything you and I have talked about so far is the fact that these groups don't have a clear remit. It is some Frankenstein nonsense of change management, project management, facilitation, celebration, tracking, training, God knows what vibes. I don't know, dude, coaching. It's just like I talked to someone fairly recently who decided to DIY that was in the process of shifting their org design team from being a pull-based team to help businesses, you know, implement new ways of working in order to execute, to being a team that worked to benchmarks to get the organization to industry benchmarks by level. I'm just like, the remit is all over the place. I mean, first of all, that's the worst remit to have if you have
I will
that
say,
one,
can
like,
we
boo.
do an episode on benchmarks sometime? Because
Yeah.
I'm so tired of hearing about benchmarks.
I know. It's so, yeah.
Holy
I mean, when
shit.
she told me that, I was like, wow. Like, I feel like you guys are doing it right now and you're going to shift to this
Yeah.
other thing,
Okay.
which,
Yeah.
could be part of why we didn't win that business. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's a bad idea to have your org design team just like have a bunch of numbers that they're supposed to hit. And yet, at least it's a clearer remit than a lot of
True.
what I see. So, a
True.
lot of what I see, to your point, is we bought a PowerPoint deck from McKinsey. It was very expensive. Now we need to do it. Transformation office, over to you.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Good
And
luck.
then very open for interpretation. And transformation office, over to you. By the way, transformation office is like 3 FTE.
Yeah.
And
Right.
it's like, sick, bro. What are we doing? And so my idea here is like really start with I'm gonna ask Jack to link to a thing that I show groups like this all the time, which is actually around finding product market fit. I think when you're the org design or org effectiveness or transformation change office, and we're using those interchangeably today, what happens too often is that you are either a you are generally a solution seeking a problem. You are a team of experts that has been spun up and is meant to go fix something or go execute something, and the rest is left pretty unclear. I think
Mhm.
the best thing that this kind of team can do, whether you've been up and running for 10 years or 10 minutes, is really understand what your end user's problem is. And when I say validate their problems, I mean validate them like they actually are going to solve them. If I was leading an org effectiveness team in an organization, I wouldn't tackle one problem that the business wasn't willing to pay for external support to solve. Because if they're not willing to pay somebody to do it, it's not worth doing and they're going to lose interest. First, figure out what those real ass problems are. Then, figure out if you have a solution to that problem that your customer internally agrees is a solution they would pay for. Do a bunch of that before you try to make anything default, make anything scaled, make anything standard, grow your practice, add more headcount. This lack of sort of product thinking in these teams, I think, is killing them. And I think it's the lack of clear remit and then the lack of customer discovery is, I think, how they end up becoming generalized helper, order taker, generally good resources that have a difficult time articulating impact.
Yeah. That's well said.
That was like 3 ideas, so that's all I'm gonna do. But like remit, customer discovery, look at this thing that there will be a link to, and have a think about how clear you are on that. It's really, really critical.
Cool. I'm also just going to do one. And the thing that I'm kind of sitting with here is that if I put myself in the shoes of a client or a potential client, and I'm weighing the decision about going DIY versus hiring someone. I can like feel the the massiveness of the decision to hire somebody to undertake a very massive piece of work. Like we're talking about transformation, whether you're using that word or something else.
Right.
Generally, we're talking about a pretty broad body of work that can be hard to define, is generally kind of ambitious and unclear.
Right.
And thinking about, well, how do you bring somebody in to do that work, I think can also feel huge and overly ambitious. And I think a lot of people just kind of
Totally.
stop there. And like
Totally.
so much of like the growth efforts that I undertake is like helping people understand like what it actually looks like to get after this work that is so huge and ill-defined. And I think a thing that folks can do is just find a place, a thing, a place, an event, a something where partnering with us or somebody else like us doing this work where you can really just test it out. And
Yeah.
whether it's just for a little bit
Yeah.
of time or just
No big
a
bangs.
very no big bangs, including hiring for like 1.5 million project. No. Like what is 3 months of a
Yeah.
couple hundred K for a large organization, which is nothing, look like? And let's have a very real conversation about what we've been able to do and what we might be able to do by re-upping that or going a little bit
Yeah.
larger. But there's no reason something that has really large ambitions has to also be a super large decision to get started. There may be points
Right.
later on where we want to take bigger chunks, but at least then we have more information and we can feel more confident. The getting started step can be so small.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And I think that's really good advice to take whether you're internal or external.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Like,
Yeah.
what's the leverage point? What's like a banger small first thing that isn't, I've been handed a work stream that is change how we work for an organization of 100,000 people. What now?
Yeah. Good luck.
Yeah.
Have fun.
Good luck. Our hats are off.
Yeah. All right. I think it's a good place to wrap. So let's do that. Let's wrap this up. As you know, we always are looking for new topics for the show. I mean, I have a big list, but a lot of them come from folks sending me ideas. So
Yeah.
if you have one that a pattern that you're having trouble changing, shoot us a note at podcast@theready.com.
This show is engineered by Taylor Marvin and produced by our tired but very lovely friend Jack Van Amberg. At Work with The Ready is created by The Ready, where we help organizations and our DIY friends around the world change the way they work. Thank you so much for listening.